Okay, it's 9 o'clock, so we will kick off. Good morning, good afternoon, possibly good evening, everybody, wherever you are around the world. Thank you very much for joining us for this second post-conference webinar for New Directions East Asia. The conference itself took place, as you can see, in December last year. And in this session, we're going to listen to the panel discussion, or one of the panel discussions that happened during the conference last year. And we have two of the speakers from there with us. So we have Dr. Jamie Dunlea from the British Council in London and Dr. Neus Figueras Casanovas from the Ministry of Education in Barcelona, Spain. So we will be playing the video for you to watch. The video will last approximately an hour. And then after that time, you will have the chance to ask your questions to Jamie and Neus. We would ask you to put your questions in the chat, please, as we go through. But if you want to ask your question live after the event, then just so after the video, when we come to the discussion, just let us know in the chat and we can unmute and allow you to put your microphone on and put your camera on if you want to. But otherwise, everybody is automatically muted with their cameras off, just so that you're aware. The other thing to be aware of is that the recording, the video and the webinar is being recorded. We will have the whole webinar available for you to watch on YouTube after the event as well. So if you have colleagues who have missed the event or who couldn't attend, then you can pass the YouTube link onto them afterwards. Okay, so as I say, just to be aware that anything that you say, or if you write it in the chat, it will be recorded just going forward. So I will now hand over to my colleague Jan, who will set the recording going for us, and I will see you back here in roughly an hour. So I will stop sharing, Jan, and that will be over to you.
Welcome back, everyone. Please have your seats and we will begin promptly. The main theme of the New Directions Conference this year is Standards and Frameworks in Language Assessment. I'm pleased to introduce our first panel discussion of the conference, entitled Synergies and Tensions, Exploiting the Benefits of the Common Dimensions of Standards for Language Education and Assessment. Let's welcome to the stage the panel, the chair of the discussion, Dr. Jamie Dunlea, Assessment Research Group Manager and Senior Researcher at the British Council. And our panelists, Anindito Aditomo, PhD, Head of Agency for Standardization, Curriculum and Assessment in Education, Ministry of Education, Culture, Research and Technology, Republic of Indonesia. Dr. Neus Figueras Casanovas, from the Ministry of Education, Catalonia, Spain. Professor Negishi Masashi, Professor at Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, Japan. Dr. Nick Seville, Director of Thought Leadership for Cambridge English and the elected Secretary General of the Association of the Language Testers in Europe. Dr. Jamie Dunlea, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for joining us after lunch. A very nice lunch it was indeed. I'm just looking for my clicker. So we've already had our introductions. Thank you, Maria. And some of our speakers have already been on stage this morning. And I think a lot of the themes that we're starting to see emerge from the discussion throughout the morning, we're going to have a chance to revisit and hopefully discuss in a little bit more depth today. Let me see if I can work this. I'm not very good at clickers. Oh, there we go. Okay. So this is our panel. Oh, the order of speakers is not quite what it will be, but never mind. I'll introduce them as we go through. Each of the speakers today brings a special perspective, quite a rich set of experiences from designing, implementing, validating, gathering evidence, as Barry was talking about this morning, changing, localizing, adapting standards. And so we're going to try and draw on those experiences and then look for the tensions, the synergies that might occur across those contexts. And particularly, we'll have an opportunity to revisit some of the very important questions that Dr. Anandito mentioned this morning regarding the reform agenda here in Indonesia. So we'll see what our international, regional, local perspectives, what they share, and what we might be able to learn from each other. Just to kick off, just to refresh our memory, because this is going to come out throughout the discussion, we have the comprehensive learning system concept, a triangle in which all of the corners are linked and integral to a system. So we have our curriculum, we have the delivery of the curriculum by teachers and through learning, teacher training, materials, and we have assessment. This isn't an assessment conference, so we tend to talk about assessment a lot, but it's only one part of the system. But what's really, really important is that standards, we've been hearing a lot about standards, sit at the center of the system, and they need to drive and be connected to each of the parts. So I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm now going to hand over to Neus, and Neus is going to kick off with the first of our range of international and local experiences with standard.
Thank you very much, Jamie, and thank you for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure. What I'm going to do is take the perspective of the CFR, which has already been mentioned this morning. It's not really a set of standards. It was presented as a framework in 2001, and I will also be referring to the companion volume that was published in 2020, and many of you will be aware of that. And although I'll be talking mainly about the CFR, I'd like to draw your attention as well to other sets of standards or guidelines or frameworks that are already in existence. We talk about the CFR that is not a language-specific framework. We may talk about the ACTFL guidelines, which are not language-specific either. But then we have the Canadian benchmarks, the Chinese standards for English, the CFRJ, which were originally developed for English, and many more that I am not aware of, but which could very easily replace that circle that Jamie placed in the triangle, at the center of the triangle. Many of you will have heard about the CFR, and I'm sure that many of you have got the book at home, or at least in your computer. But I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the Council of Europe, which is not the European Union, was set off to improve the quality of communication among Europeans of different languages and different cultural backgrounds. So that's why the CFR is not based on one language only, and it's not meant to be useful for English only. The CFR is meant to cater for all the languages at the time spoken in Europe, although it's been used throughout the world these days. And the main mission of the CFR was to help all the parties concerned with organized language learning, that goes beyond teachers and publishers, to help them share their objectives and methods, to make them clear and explicit for the benefit of those who use the products of their work. So the Council of Europe was very aware of the fact that stakeholders are very important in any language education endeavor. The summary of the CFR could be that there's a horizontal approach, the action-oriented approach, how languages are taught, how languages are spoken, how languages are learned, and what does it mean to learn a language. And then there's the vertical approach, which categorizes this level of proficiency from A1 to C2. The levels have already been mentioned today. The idea was to improve transparency, comparability, and stimulate discussion in terms of progress. This is the inverted cone that is usually used to illustrate the different levels of the CFR. The higher you get in the process, the more things you do in the language, and the better your language can work for you. And the objectives of the CFR were to plan language learning programs, language certification, self-directed learning, and taking into consideration what a person can do in the language, how well this can be done under the weak circumstances. All this is known facts, but I thought it would make sense to repeat them because this is basically at the core of language education. How useful has it been so far? I come from Spain and I can talk about the situation in Spain, but because of my involvement with the Council of Europe, I can also talk about the situation in other parts of the world. When the CFR was published, we started talking about, is my B1 like your B1? We were obsessed in 2001 up until 2010 about, is my B1 your B1? We were very worried about equating and equivalences. With time, we worked towards thinking of, I think that it's better to describe what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. What Professor O'Sullivan was referring to this morning about validation and evidence. What's my B1 like? What's your B1 like? In what ways are they similar? In what ways are they different? And we learned this via the process of adopting it, adapting it, and aligning our systems to the CFR, sometimes doing big adaptations, sometimes smaller adaptations. That's something that's been brought up today as well. And in any case, the CFR received a huge success. It was translated into 43 languages. It was most adopted in assessment. 2 months after its publication, a lot of exams, a lot of textbooks already said, this is a B1 textbook, this is a B1 exam, etc. And policymakers were also very happy to be able to label what level students or learners should leave school at, what level they should enter university, etc. But the real fact is that users vary across countries, across contexts, and in learning and teaching, that is the classroom, there's not evidence that the CFR has been put into practice in all its power and abilities. Users are often claimed at the macro level rather than in the classroom. They're espoused. Everybody talks about the B1, the C1, and the CFR, but really teaching and training practices are not always in concordance with what the CFR recommends. And there's some aspects which have been used quite well, but there's some aspects which have still to be used properly. That's why the Council of Europe published a recommendation asking ministries of education to read the framework properly and to pay attention to all the recommendations and all the suggestions, and also published a companion volume that would expand what could not be included in 2001, and also include aspects that would be more useful for L1 teachers and also for primary and secondary school teachers. The issue now is, although there seems to be some synergy agreement at the macro level in that the CFR is a global standard that may be useful, that can be common, that to a certain, I've written down a question mark in new, because not everything in the CFR is new, and not everything in the companion volume is new. This seems to be used as a set standards. The vertical dimension seems to be mostly accepted. It's been very much used in policy, and it's very much used in a top-down fashion. The tensions that we need to pay attention to, perhaps, is how to adapt it locally, how to adapt it to diverse needs, how to adapt it to existing curricula. I wrote down old, but I'd rather use Barry's term existing. How standards are different or similar to objectives, how far we're looking after the horizontal, what it means to learn a language, and I think that Nick's going to talk about that later, than about only the levels. how far policy materializes in the classrooms, and how far practitioners really pay attention to what the policies say. And we're back to the transfer from adoption to adaptation, and how far can we be good at aligning our practices to our standards. Finish.
Thank you, Neus. That was a great overview in 7 minutes of something which has taken many decades to put together and to put into practice. And you can see there's still some work to be done, but we've achieved quite a lot. In my brief intervention, I'd like to think about with you the nature of setting standards specifically for languages and for language learning and assessment. And what do we actually mean by standards and standardization? Well, the take home from this particular part is I'd like to focus on 3 meanings. The nature of language and how it is standardized for the purposes of education and of course for the purposes of assessment. That doesn't mean to say we, for example, have to have one standard, for example, for English, which is a polycentric language, but whatever we are going to teach, we have to describe it in such a way that we can teach it and test it. So at the heart of language learning and assessment is the language that you're learning. And of course, the language you're learning could be one which is your local language. It could be one of many languages that are existing in your country, like in Indonesia, or it could be a language like English, which is, or specifically English, which is a lingua franca. That's the first thing. The second is the standards of achievement that we want to set, which is where we come in with the CFR, for example. And then something perhaps which we need to think about, and I think it picks up points made by Barry earlier, professional standards, how we go about teaching, but in our case, particularly how we do assessment in such a way that when we're making claims about levels or levels of achievement, that they're valid and reliable. I put this point in red at the bottom. These are not separate. So this is system thinking. It's about how the things relate to each other. So the first is which variety is to be learned and assessed. You have to think if you're thinking plurilingually, some languages are not fully described in such a way that they could be taught. So a few decades ago, in the context of ALTE, people were introducing into schooling languages which hadn't been taught or learned traditionally. For example, Slovene, which is a language used in Slovenia, was being taught in higher education. The people teaching it had to produce grammar books and vocabularies and tests based on the CFR in order for that to work in their context. So we do need to think about this. And this is the language part, I think, that Barry also called out. Is language, setting standards for language, different because of the nature of language than setting standards for other curriculum subjects? That's a question we could pick up later. The second is the one which we're familiar with, which is the meaning related to outcomes of learning, the proficiency level in our case that policymakers set as the learning goal, either as an aspiration or in some other way, but it's related to curriculum, syllabus, and so forth. But also in that context, and I think we've had this called out, the level that's taught in school has to be available for people outside of school. That is, it has to represent in some way an achievement which provides learners with the communicative language ability. And this, of course, is at the core of the CFR, which implements a so-called action-oriented approach. And I think you had very small, but it was on one of your slides, the idea of a plurilingual competence. So the cumulative ability is not one language or another, it's a range of language skills which are acquired in school and on a lifelong basis. So that's the CFR. The third point, I think, which is specific to my presentation, is the nature of standards when understood as professional standards. These are related to the quality and the quality of education generally, and this is why you have standards agencies. But what does it mean for language assessment? Because I think this is an area which probably requires increased professionalism, generally speaking, around the world, and to be open to more scrutiny. In this context, a standard probably could be considered something like an agreed way of doing something. And in many cases, whether it's standards for the plumbing profession or for the medical profession, these tend to be set by the professions themselves and may lead to laws and regulations, but may not be. They may be used for self-monitoring or to increase collaboration. And that's the sort of work we do in ALTE, the Association of Language Testers, where we collaborate across many languages to try and implement the same agreed ways of doing things for language assessment. In general, these tend to be, standards of this kind tend to be set out in documentation, like the APA standards, which are for all types of education and psychological testing. And in the last 25 or 30 years, language assessment organizations have developed their own standards. So the Code of Ethics for ILTA, the International Language Testing Association, and in the case of ALTE, our Code of Practice and our Quality Management System. And the point about the Quality Management System is it's a form of, well, it's a theory of action, really, as Barry was talking about. It's how you put your standards into practice in your own context, for your own exam and for your own users or stakeholders, as Barry called them, and some recognition of that through the awarding of a quality mark. Conclusion, we must take all of these into account because they are related, but if we get it right, we will make a contribution to better decisions in society and a greater contribution to social justice and fairness in using language tests.
Thank you, Nick. We had one other speaker who wasn't able to make it in time. He may still join us for the discussion at the end, but he may not be available. So we're going to move on now to Masashi, who's going to talk to us about the CFRJ experience in Japan.
Thank you again. Okay. So can you hear me? Okay. Hello again. Okay, I'll talk about our CFRJ project. Oh, yeah. This is my part. Okay. The missing piece in the learning system in Japan. Okay, I'll talk about the CFRJ project. Okay, our project started in 2004. Initially, we were trying to develop a comprehensive framework for English language teaching from scratch, based on our findings of second language acquisition research. But we did not know how to achieve this. However, an encounter with the CEFR changed the situation completely. Our research project started to evolve around the CEFR with the decision to adapt the original CEFR to English language education in Japan. Because of this decision, we can align our framework with the CEFR. In this respect, there is no tension between local and global uses. In 2012, we released the first version of the CFRJ in English and in Japanese. And the CFRJ at this stage was a collection of scaled can-do descriptors designed to fit into English language education in Japan. From 2012 to 2016, CEFR-J reference level description projects were conducted. These are the tools we developed, and they consist elements of delivery. From 2016 to 2020, we developed CEFR-J-based tests. These test items can be used, of course, for assessment. In 2020 and 2025, we are now applying the CEFR-J to secondary school education, secondary school classrooms. Important features of the CEFR-J are as follows. We created a framework consisting of granular levels towards the lower end with a set of can-do descriptors so that learners and teachers can see tangible progress. New descriptors were created and scaled. So some of the characteristics of the CEFR-J were adopted in the CEFR-CV, companion volume, Neus just mentioned. This shows principled localization may be able to contribute back to the original CEFR, so the impact may be bilateral to some extent. Okay, this is the famous O'Sullivan's comprehensive learning system. O'Sullivan 2020 argues that the success of any learning system depends on the close alignment of elements that have traditionally been regarded as independent of one another. Curriculum, teaching learning materials, teaching approaches, teacher training, and assessment. When I first saw this triangle at a conference in London in 2020, I didn't understand its significance very well, to be honest. However, as I use this figure to understand the several contexts of language learning and teaching in Japan, I'm beginning to realize the importance of the figure. Okay, let's take it's small letters, sorry. Let's take a look at English language teaching in primary and secondary education in Japan. The course of study is a national curriculum in Japan. We have the courses of study for primary education and secondary education. The courses of study in Japan are loosely aligned with the CEFR. They have the same framework as the CEFR for communicative language activities, and the teaching objectives will take the form of can-do descriptors, kind of. However, the can-do descriptors are different from those in the CEFR or CEFR-J, and the levels are not specified. It should be noted, however, that key concepts of the courses of study are language activities which are appropriate to the purpose, situation, and context of communication, which might lead to the adoption of an action-oriented approach with the concept of social agency. On the other hand, authorized textbooks are not aligned with the CEFR. For example, there are about 30 authorized textbooks for upper secondary education in Japan, and they are all different. And there are few elements of an action-oriented approach and few examples of social agents, and CEFR levels are not specified. Classroom assessment basically consists of midterm, end-of-term exams. I have been involved in teacher training for more than 30 years and have seen dozens of teacher-made tests every year. As far as I can see, they are not aligned with the CEFR. Most of the test items are not task-based and no contexts are specified. Just a conventional old type of, thank you, quiz. On the other hand, however, many high-stakes tests are aligned with the CEFR. In Japan, the use of the CEFR is not mandatory, but voluntary. And the CEFR-J also adopts a laissez-faire policy. It is only used by those who see benefits in using the CEFR or CFRJ. Many people might find the CEFR relevant to assessment, but not so much to a curriculum or delivery. If there is any missing piece, i.e. lack of alignment with the CEFR, these must be filled in by the learner or the teacher. This is where attention is built up. Furthermore, it is only in the case of active users of the CEFR that the learning system becomes truly comprehensive. If curriculum, delivery, and assessment are aligned with each other, great synergy will be generated. Hopefully, the CFR will make a good foundation for curriculum and delivery as well in Japan, and fill in the missing piece in the system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Musashi. Okay. And now I'd like to call on Dr. Anandito to revisit some of the ideas and talk about the standards from the perspective of the work and reform in Indonesia.
Yes, thank you, Jamie. I don't have any slides. I used up all my slides this morning, unfortunately. So just let me talk about several points that's already mentioned by the previous speakers as well. And I'll start by commenting on the irony of standards, at least in policy discourse in Indonesia. It's ironic because standards in Indonesia are meant to standardize. I don't like the, for example, the official English version of my agency's name is the Agency for Standardization, which I think is wrong. It should be the Agency for Education Standards, not standardization. But that reflects the mindset in Indonesia, that standards are used to standardize, right? To narrow the gaps existing within the system. To make our education system more equitable. A very noble intention, very noble purpose. But it's ironic because standards not only often fails to reduce gaps, to improve equity, standards sometimes even mask the existence of disparities, of gaps within the system, and thereby prolonging the gaps, because it makes the disparities within the system invisible. Now, let me elaborate a little bit for those of you who are not familiar with the Indonesian system. In our context, standards are meant by law. It's written in the education law. Standards are meant to set minimum criteria for teacher qualifications, teacher competencies, for example, facilities in schools, proficiency standards for students to be able to graduate primary, secondary schools. That's by law in Indonesia. We have to set minimum requirements for 8 things: graduate competencies, teaching and learning processes, assessment practices, school management, and so on, facilities and so on. So what does it mean that standards are minimum criteria? It means that they have to be met by the relevant parties, by students, by teachers, principals, districts, and that they are legally binding. So in Indonesia, standards is not aspirational. It's not something you aspire to. It's something you must meet. Otherwise, you are breaking the law. That is our legal context here. So theoretically, if a school does not meet certain standards and facilities, they should be closed down. They will lose their permit. Again, the idea is to remove disparities. We want all schools to have, a certain level of facilities in place. Makes a lot of sense. If a student doesn't meet the minimum level of proficiency stated in the standards, they should not be able to graduate or past year 6 or year 9. That is by law. But of course, very few schools get closed down because they don't meet certain standards. No, not many, maybe very, very few students don't graduate because they don't meet the proficiency standards. I shared with you this morning the data from the national assessment. Only 1 out of 2 students meet the minimum requirements for reading literacy. So if we are to enforce the standards strictly, then we will have half of our students not graduating from primary school. Doesn't make any sense. So we let them graduate. So that is the irony of standards in the Indonesian context, at least, is that we want to use it as a tool to improve equity, but in fact, standards contribute to prolonging gaps because they mask the existing gaps within the system. It is a mirage that we have an equitable system, unfortunately. So the question is, do we need standards then? What do we need? Do we need frameworks, guidelines? What do we need? And answering this question will depend on what we want to achieve. What is our goal? And this is where Merdeka Belajar, our reform, comes in. Because Merdeka Belajar sets a very clear goal that we want our students to be able to become lifelong learners. And for that, they need certain dispositions, they need certain mindsets, they need certain conceptual tools, skills, including some level of proficiency in English. So what is the implication for English teaching and learning and standards? Well, let me answer this negatively first. What we don't want in English or for other foreign language teaching and learning is what you mentioned. We don't want to be preoccupied with equating whether my B1 is the same as your B1. That is not a debate that we want to have. It's unproductive for the system. The question rather is what kind of B1 we want to achieve in the system. And the answer may very well be different for different schools and different districts in Indonesia. So what we are looking for, I call it standards or frameworks or whatever, is something that can drive behavior in the direction of building students, first, confidence, and second, fluency in using English for learning. That is in the context of our Merdeka Belajar reform. If our students are confident enough to use English for self-development, then we have achieved our goal. I will leave it at that. We are, as I mentioned, we are still formulating the policies with regards to English language teaching and learning. We are building a roadmap that hopefully we can share with the public next year, maybe mid next year. So again, I invite any of you, if you have anything to share with us and the Ministry of Education regarding the roadmap towards what we want to achieve, please let us know. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, well, we definitely want to have discussion and some questions from the audience as well. I'd just like to make a few points. There are a few interesting things that I think came through. And one of them was the constant change. And I think, Masashi, you mentioned earlier this morning about how it'll probably keep changing and keep validating. The validation evidence is not just about finding out if we're doing it right. It's about finding out how we might be able to do it better and then changing. And there was pointed out the CFR. I mean, we had 2001, we have the companion volume in 2020. At no point do we think we know everything we need to know, or we shouldn't feel that way. The idea of change and improvement should be part of the system, I think. And we're all growing. The CFRJ feeding back the pre-A1 level, which many countries and people around the world complained about not having something appropriate for very beginner learners. And that's been added through a local experience that was still relevant to others as well. So I think the idea of change was really important. As the upcoming president of the European Association of Language Testing and Assessment, Nick, I would be remiss not to point out that you missed our guidelines for good practice on your list of standards, the IALTA guidelines, with the ILTA ones. So yes, and we are, once again, looking at updating and revising those because change is necessary. I think that one of the tensions and synergies that came through everyone is this idea between top-down, bottom-up, compulsory, voluntary, the implementation side of it, and flexibility, how much flexibility there should be in the system. One of the questions I'd like to ask everyone is the idea of, if we do use proficiency standards or frameworks to set our learning goals, within an education system, how much flexibility should there be in setting those goals? Because in many of the countries I've worked in, one of the, I think, mistakes that I've seen is that sometimes people try to set one goal for everybody to achieve, and how appropriate that is or how achievable that is. And I'd just perhaps like to go around the panel and hear your thoughts on setting levels and learning goals for within an education system. Nino, would you like to lead off on that?
I definitely leaning towards having much more flexibility. So as opposed to legally binding minimum sets of standards that everyone needs to meet, we need frameworks and guidelines that can be adapted to specific contexts. I mean, imagine a school in Jakarta. We have one of the parts of Jakarta is outside of the main island. It's the Kepulauan Seribu, the Thousand Islands region. That's very different to Jakarta, the city. Yeah. A teacher in central Jakarta will be teaching students who are coming to school, being familiar with books, being accustomed to discussing and debating with their parents, even using English in their day-to-day interaction. Should we set the same standards and proficiency goals for those kids with the kids from Kepulauan Seribu who have no such exposure at home? Definitely the answer is no. But that leaves the question of, again, disparity. That is the tension here. Having a flexible framework may also mean the danger of having a flexible framework is that those who are more advanced will stay, in the front, and those who are behind will always be behind.
Disparity accepted rather than challenged is the danger. Yeah. Masashi, would you like to give your thoughts on setting the goals?
Can you hear us? Me? Okay, thank you. Of course, one standard for everybody is unrealistic and it's not desirable, I think. And I'd like to just introduce the concept of profiling in the CFR or CFR-CV. We have different needs. So for example, in my case, I'm still learning French, and I don't have to read anymore. So basically, I'd like to communicate with the French people orally, just speak and listen would be enough. So I maybe have to be at B1 in speaking and listening, but maybe A1 or A2 in reading and listening, reading and writing. But when it comes to the high stakes tests like entrance exams, it's a different story. Well, maybe we can change the entrance exam systems. But in Japan, we have defined capacity for one department. So we have to take all the candidates up to that number. So, maybe, candidates might argue that I don't have to speak, but we want someone who can speak English. So this kind of decision is very difficult to make, I think.
Okay, thank you, Nick. What are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts on this are that's why we need a common framework of reference to refer to, not to have something which is imposed upon us, right? We're in an era which is sometimes characterized now as Industry 5, which is the era of industry and activities which are entirely person-centric, which take into account diversity and sustainability of what we're doing. So in our case, it's putting the learner and learning at the center, and then finding ways through education to support the learning of languages across the lifespan. So starting in school in order to create the right dispositions and approaches to it, and then finding ways to accredit success or to provide feedback which will support further learning. So increasingly integrating learning and assessment, increasingly using assessment for formative purposes and not simply for high stakes accreditation. The point about standardization, though, I think, is if you are going to use high stakes tests, should they exist, then you will need professional standards in the organization that produces them, so that if you are producing what you claim to be a B2 or B1, whatever it is, which tests reading or speaking and listening skills, you need to have defined those skills appropriately in order to test them. So you need constructs, and then you need a delivery system for the assessment, which guarantees that every time you administer your test, it gives a fair and valid outcome. So standardization in our profession of assessment is obviously something we need, and you need professional standards for it.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm not that sure about setting different standards or different levels to cater for diversity. Maybe we should be we should be thinking of a common framework that would allow to teach in relation to the level of the students, and then start thinking of standardized tests which are multi-level, which can, to a certain if we decide that what we are considering as low-level schools get lower levels of achievement as the target, we might discriminate the 5 students that can do better in that school, or the 10 schools, and we might perpetuate that the schools with high-level students are always doing better. So I think that we should, crack the code and think of some ways of perhaps going back to the minimum standards, but at the same time, when assessing what the students know, thinking of being able to say at what level we worry sometimes a lot about fulfilling minimum standards and not giving value to those who have gone much beyond the standards. So we should try and find a way of marrying both.
Okay, thank you, everybody. So what I would like to do now is open up for open discussion. And our 5th panelist has been able to join us. So Dr. Sabanzan, if you'd like to join us for the Q&A, and I'd like to open up for the discussion. We have microphones for the audience to be able to ask any questions. Yeah, if you'd want to take a couple of mics from here. See if you can turn that one on. Okay, so please, if you'd like to put your hand up, if you would like to ask a question for clarification or even a challenge. Yes, we've got a question at the back there. If you'd like Any particular panelists to ask, to answer your question, please indicate. Otherwise, of course, whoever feels like they have an interesting comment to make will jump in.
I'm not sure it should be addressed to any particular panelist, but it's triggered by what Nick was talking about, the three aspects of standardization, one of which was standardization of languages, which are extremely essential for standardization of assessment. But our classrooms are not just multilingual, but also multi-dialectal. And when a single language, which is taken as the basis of assessment, exists in multiple dialects, and then we define proficiency for assessment in terms of particular dialects, how does it affect our overall framework of assessment? And whether any standardization should take into account and address this kind of diversity.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'd like to open that up to the panel for anyone who feels like they'd like to comment. Yeah. There's a microphone there if you want to see if that one. Yep.
I would like to share the findings of my research on English as a subject in basic education in ASEAN. The problem that we're having in the ASEAN region, according to the data, is that there's been misalignment in terms of policy and also research and also assessment. And in terms of assessing different languages, the idea of the CFR as a standard, for example, being used in Europe, is that to promote plurilingualism. And many countries in Europe has been able to do that as a standard. So they want to promote English, Spanish, Dutch, and other languages. However, in ASEAN, what seems to be happening is that the idea of using CFR being implemented in Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia is only for the promotion of English, by neglecting the national languages as well as the indigenous languages. So it has become very much problematic at the moment. And one of my criticism of the CFR is that it is absent in terms of promoting translanguaging. So if you are familiar with the concept of translanguaging, it is the idea of employing different features of different languages in one linguistic repertoire. But it is becoming very difficult when we are only aiming for one, for the proficiency of one language, as it is happening in the CFR, as well as other standardized assessment.
Okay, thank you. So the idea of focusing on only one language, English, is problematic. And I think to get back to the question, though, it's not just about having multiple languages, but you're talking about even multiple dialects and how feasible it is to develop and apply our standards across all of that diversity in a classroom, I think is. Okay.
That was one of the missing bits that you could identify in the CFR 2001. It's not that it was a missing bit, it was that it was not explicitly said that translanguaging was something to take into consideration, although Nick has already hinted at the fact that the CFR contemplates language proficiency as an overall competency. Language proficiency is understood as the collection of all the proficiencies that you have in all the languages that are in your repertoire. That was already there in 2001. But in the 2020 companion volume, the idea of translanguaging has become more explicit. There's explicit scales on using intercultural and interlinguistic domains and commands of language. So, and that's because the Council of Europe became aware of the CFR being used in primary and secondary, which was not the initial idea behind the CFR 201. So something I didn't say was that it's taken us in Europe and in other areas in the world 20 years to come to terms with what the CFR 2001 means and can do. Let's see how many years it takes us to identify the issues in the companion volume.
Can we still pursue that question?
Yeah, please do.
I would make 2 points really. One is that because you have had to describe a language in order to teach it, to create a curriculum, doesn't necessarily mean that you want to impose a standard on everybody as if it was the only one version of the language which is valid. And that means that when you are teaching or giving feedback on a learner's proficiency, you can certainly set tasks which focus on more of the language's practice. In other words, the communication intention, the communication effectiveness of the learner. And it's no longer necessary, and perhaps it was wrong in the past, to focus on specific microcosms of the language, like the vocabulary and the grammar, and to particularly feedback on, no, this is wrong, this is right. I don't think that was what actually the communicative approach was, to move away from that, and the action-oriented approach is very much about can do. So what we're trying to set for learners is abilities to use the language while they're in school, but also to develop the aspiration to carry on learning beyond school. So it's taking a mindset towards communication, and some of the best reform innovations in Europe now have something which they call 3 languages in schooling, which is about using languages in a sort of cross the school approach, where the child comes to school with her home language, and there may be many of them. They learn the language of schooling, which will obviously be a national language or regional language, and then they're adding in the languages of the curriculum, sometimes from an early age. So you're maintaining the first language, you're developing literacy in the schooling language, and you're additionally adding in foreign language, English usually, but it's targeted as a way of using language, and translanguaging in that context is totally encouraged. And there's some excellent projects, for example, in the Basque country, where there's Basque and Spanish and English, all three languages being encouraged through practice, not just through curriculum and syllabus specification.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I would like to use that question as a segue to highlight the dangers of using standardized assessments to drive teaching and learning behavior. I'm an assessment person, academically speaking, so I really believe in the power of using assessments to drive what teachers do and how students learn. I think teaching to the test is probably a universal phenomenon. But having said that, what you highlighted just now is like the dangers of using standardized assessments when you have a particular, in this case, dialect, as the gold standard to evaluate the proficiency of spoken English from the test takers. Right? You cannot get away from that if you are using assessments for high stakes purposes, where you need to compare one on an objective metric and then to sort them from the best to the worst, like in a selection scenario. Right? But that is not the scenarios that teachers face in their day-to-day teaching. Right? What teachers face is the problem of motivating students to improve their confidence, to improve their proficiency in using the English language. Now, this is not answering your question, But I would like to pose another question or challenge. If that is the case, then what is the role of standardized assessments in the kind of reform that we are currently undertaking in Indonesia? Yes, I agree that we will need a certain form of standardized assessment so that we can monitor where we are at the moment in our journey towards our goal. But using standardized assessments, especially those that discriminate against local variations, for example, in terms of dialect, might do more damage than good.
Okay, well, answer a question with a question, always good. So would anyone else like to comment on the role of standardized assessments within our idea of standards in education reform? Anyone on the phone?
I would just make a comment about assessment generally, that for assessments to be valid, they need a context, a purpose, and a use specified. So you can't really answer a question about standardized tests unless you know what you're testing and why. So if you want different forms of outcome at the end of different phases of education, you might specify a particular level and a particular type of competence for students graduating from vocational colleges, which will be different from those graduating high school from highly academic colleges, which need to lead you into higher education. And in some cases, you might be, as Masashi was saying, you might be putting more emphasis on literary skills, like reading and writing for academic purposes. In others, you might be putting more emphasis on, well, the ability to use language for performing certain tasks in the workplace. And increasingly, we ought to be thinking more in these terms rather than thinking, shall we have a standardized test or not? The tests that you produce for those purposes can be standardized, so you can then make selections, or you can use it for policy-making purposes. But it shouldn't be for policy-making purposes as the first role. It should be for educational purposes and for the purposes of accrediting learning.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Yeah, and well, if anyone's read or watched The Lord of the Rings, one ring to rule them all, we all know where that ended up. It didn't end well, so I think the idea of one size fits all is probably not a good idea. Okay, would there any comments here? Do we have a microphone? Yep, okay.
Thank you. Ed Fermin from Manila, the Philippines. I very much like what has been articulated about the purpose of standardization. It's not really ultimately for policy making, because if that were the case, I think what's happening with the issuance of international tests, which are standardized to some extent, the predisposition of many nation states right now, or ministries of education, is in effect to teach to the test, which I think is going to do more harm than helping our students. So I guess this is more of a reaction that we need to look at standardized examinations as pathways by which we can determine how near or far students are in terms of globally accepted norms, with the goal of specifying or determining the extent to which our provisions for learning are aligned or relevant given those international norms. The globalized education ecosystem is there to tell us that there are expectations, sure. But to bring back to the consciousness that there are local realities that we need to contend with, and I think this is circling back to the morning session, is an imperative that is critical for all of us in the education sector. So on the one hand, we try to speak a similar language of how we look at competencies and outcomes in education. That's the function of these standardized tests. But eventually, it should also prompt us towards determining the quality, the relevance, the sustainability, and the accessibility of learning design and delivery provisions at each jurisdiction or each state, because that will account for the narrative behind the numbers that standardized tests generate. Just my quick thought.
And of course, I think what Nick's pointing out too, standardized could be just standardized within a school. It doesn't have to be standardized as in a globally standardized test, just as long as if we're going to administer what should be the same assessment even within our same school, we want to standardize that across our classrooms, across our teachers, for instance. So standardized itself can have a lot of flex, I think. But one thing that came out from this, I think, is we're talking about assessment. And remember, assessment is only one part of our triangle, but this is an assessment conference. But we're talking about assessment as evidence and assessment in terms of monitoring and achieving goals. I'd like to find out what the panel think the role of assessment is for the learners themselves, not the policymakers, not the teachers. What is the role of our assessments for the learners within standards and aligning with standards? What do they get anything from it? Is it useful for them, or is it really more above their level and it's for teachers and policymakers to evaluate the system? Open that up for any thoughts. Yes, Neus.
Well, I'll talk about the learner and assessment later today, but I'd like to focus now on how we have ended by talking about standardization and not about the standards in language education, which was the main topic of the session. And that is also very ironical, as Nino would say, because we started talking about standards in language assessment, standards in language learning, teaching, and assessment as the center of the comprehensive learning system. And standards have to be there, either if you decide that they are aspirational or compulsory, but standards need to be the core of curriculum, assessment, and implementation. And the three need to go together. And I think that we would do our learners a favor if they were able, if we managed to communicate to them in practice, not in theory telling them, but that they saw that everything makes sense, that what we do in the classroom matches what the textbook says, what the curriculum says, what the exam is going to look like. They should see that there's some unity in what they perceive is language education or mathematics or any subject.
And I guess the language standards only make sense. It only makes sense to have language standards if we have what Barry was talking about this morning, a model of language. Do we know that things progress in a way that we can define? And is it useful to describe them in that way? And if it is, then it's useful to have language standards at different levels. 5 minutes, yes, to wrap up. But if not, then maybe we rethink. I think, Nick, you also mentioned earlier today that language standards can be as much about behaviors as well as aspects of language, and that's important to remember.
I was going to just pick up on this idea of what is the value of assessment for learners. I mean, what learners usually need to know is where they are in their learning, right? So, and where they can go next, most usefully. So, for the last 15 years, many of us have been thinking about and writing about learning-oriented assessment. And from that perspective, you can't, in education, have assessment without learning taking place. And you really don't know what is being learned, or you're not evidencing what's being learned without some forms of assessment. But we don't, in that case, we're not necessarily talking about high-stakes tests. It's become commonplace to think about assessment as for and of learning. So different functions of feedback at different stages of a learning process, during the process or at the end of the process, feeding back or feeding forward. And this sort of integrated way of thinking about assessment more holistically, I think, is where we've been going in language testing particularly. I don't know whether that's true in other curriculum subjects, but certainly in language testing. Okay. But you need a framework of reference to know how to talk about what's being achieved.
So I'd like to wrap up now because we are almost at the end of our time. But I'd like to first thank everybody for their insights, their input, and a rich global variation with, interestingly, I always find a lot of overlap though. So global, local, and regional share a lot of the tensions and synergies. And so it's great to be able to share our experiences and perhaps learn about our solutions, as in the pre-A1 descriptors, which have now become part of the global toolkit. So I think we can always learn a lot from each other. But I'd just like to ask each of the panelists just for one final comment on something that they feel really stands out for them as significant, and they'd like all of our listeners to take away in relation to standards. And if we begin with Subhan, if just one quick comment from everybody, final summing up.
I think a large emphasis has been placed on standardization rather than contextualization. I think both of them have to go together. So that if we're talking about language assessment, it is not only about standardized tests, it is also about how those tests can be contextualized, contextually appropriate for teaching, for learning, and also for assessment.
Okay, thank you very much. Nina, would you like to make any one thought you'd like to leave us with?
Well, maybe answering your question, the role of assessment for the learners. I think assessment can be and should be a very powerful tool for learning, and that our learners, most of our learners, are not getting enough benefits from the use of assessment, not only to understand where they are in their learning journey and where they can and should go, but also in experiencing assessment as a learning process itself, because assessing yourself using a rubric, for example, is a very valuable learning experience. So,
yes. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Masashi?
Okay. Just one message. Please refer to comprehensive learning system and check if there is a missing piece. And maybe the teacher is the first person to find that missing piece and do something about it. So.
Okay. The teacher at the center. Okay. Thank you. And Nick?
Well, I would say that issues of access aside, the future of learning will be greatly facilitated by the use of technology in the next era. And that will allow us to integrate feedback and different forms of assessment much more closely with the learning activities, so the learner can actually have assessment as learning. It can be for learning, and it will also provide certification or the like of learning.
Yeah, as Barry was talking about this morning, the ongoing evaluation. And Neus, would you like to wrap up for us, please?
I'd like to perhaps refer to something that's been mentioned a couple of times, which is teaching to the test. If we managed to have a balanced curriculum, implementation, methodology, etc., and assessment, maybe teaching to the test will become part of the usual activities in the classroom that refer to standards. And rather than talk about standardized tests, we can talk about standards and how can we achieve them.
If the test is based on standards,
embrace them.
Teaching to the standards. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. And I'd like to thank the audience as well, and thank our panelists for a great discussion. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. So, hi, I would like to just introduce two of the speakers to you live, if you like. You know them already from the panel discussion there, but we have Dr. Neus Figueras Casanovas, as I said, from the Ministry of Education in Barcelona, Spain, and we have Dr. Jamie Dunlea from the British Council. Neus, you mentioned a number of standards and frameworks. You mentioned the CEFR, the Canadian benchmarks, the ACTFL, the China Standards of English, and the CEFRJ. So I've just put the slide up there. I hope you can see that. Just before we take the audience questions, as this sort of ties in rather nicely with your standards, and also with some of the questions that we've had from the audience, I'd just like to ask you, how do you reconcile standards which are normally global, such as the CEFR, the CEFRJ, the ACTFL standards, and so on? How do you reconcile those standards which are normally global to local contexts?
Is this a question for me?
It's a question primarily for you, but also for Jamie as well. I'm sure Jamie will have something to say on that. So I'll stop sharing.
Jamie. Do you want me to start?
Yeah, you go first, Neus.
I think that standards require first adoption and then adaptation, or vice versa. First adaptation, I would go for adoption and then adaptation. But then there's a certain unspoken rule which is becoming more and more common, and that is that you need to document how you adapted the standard to your context and what your adoption of those standards means in your context, so that, as I said in my bit during the panel discussion, so that we do not talk about my B1 is like your B1, but we make an effort to describe what our B1 means in our context and how it can be compared with other B1s that might be or not be exactly the same. Maybe we say that our B1 is like that for reading and listening, but then in speaking and writing, we talk about an A2 plus. So it's a question of making sure what the needs of your context are, how you're going to adapt the standards, and how you're going to document and publicize what you've done.
Okay, thanks, Neus. Jamie.
Yeah, no, I think I'd agree with Neus. I think there's two things. I think global standards, and if we take the CFR as an example, always began with the premise of the need to adapt to a local context. There's a kind of a core, or there's some key elements which maybe we can't or shouldn't try to change, depending on what we're using it for. But there'll always be local adaptation. And of course, the CFRJ is a fantastic example of how, in one local context, they wanted to maintain that sort of sense of being able to comparability and continuity with a global standard like the CFR. But then they've taken that and really adapted it to a local context to provide more depth, particularly at the lower levels. The pre-A1 descriptors in the companion volume were initiated by the context of Japan, where they felt that A1 was too high for the real beginners. So that sense of needing to adapt, I think, is always there. It's just that adapting takes a lot of work. And at a minimum, I think it's what Neus is saying. It's just really documenting why and what you've changed so that it allows comparison. Having a common standard isn't about everyone always trying to be the same. So just because you've got a common standard doesn't mean everyone has to be B1. And even your description of B1 may have things that are slightly different to mine because of your context. But having a common standard is as useful for identifying what the differences are. In one context, it may be a lot harder to develop speaking or writing skills because of a particular educational background. In another case, it may be sort of a focus on a particular way we want to use language for a particular purpose. So having common standards allows us to equally usefully identify the differences and discuss why they're different. But having a common set of kind of reference points is still really important, I think, to identify the similarities and the differences.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to read the next question. You may have already touched upon it, actually, but you may have something to add to it. So this ties in with the second question. I'll come back to the first question afterwards. But we have a question here from Kamini Taneja or Taneja. I'm not sure how to pronounce the surname, but she says, thanks for sharing the recording, really informative. One of the Indonesian panelists, Anandito, mentioned that we should not compare B1 from one country to another country, as they won't be the same, while he insisted on what the learners can do. Fair point, but the sense I got was on comparison, the learners will not demonstrate same or similar abilities. As a CEFR user in different contexts, don't we aim to use these standards across the board, and they help us maintain standardization in being able to rate candidates and develop materials and tasks that are pitched at the right level? Anything to comment on that? Jamie, do you want to start on this one?
Okay, yeah, I think it links back to what we were talking about standards. And I also think it depends when we talk about standards. I mean, we also talk about the kind of vertical dimension, but there's horizontal dimensions. Sort of like, who are we using the standards for? There are contexts in which we really do need to maintain comparability of B1 across schools, across universities, within a country, or across countries. For example, in Europe, where with the Bologna Agreement, the idea of promoting mobility across universities, but people want to have a kind of common understanding of what the language proficiency of at a B2 level is for students to be able to function and study in that language if they move across context. In that situation, well, what you're looking at is the ability to study in a language in an academic context, and people want to be able to compare. So it's really important that the B2 is consistent, because actually you're transferring people across university contexts and they have to be able to function to a similar level. So that's a situation where comparability is really important. But when you're looking at an individual school system, for instance, or a particular regional system, well, there may come a point sometimes where actually you don't want to talk about B1s at all, because it's a distraction. Maybe you do need to talk about something much more local and relevant to what you want to achieve with the students. So it depends what you're using it for. I think that's the really important thing. What I think we can't do is, like Neus pointed out, we can say that, okay, A2 plus might be a more appropriate goal for my students. But if we know my students are poor at speaking, we can't simply say they're B1 because it's my context. We still have to describe what, if B1 doesn't work for you, then throw it out the door and don't call them B1 at all, but describe what they can do and what you want them to do in your context.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. Neus, anything to add?
No, I
or
think
contradict?
No. I wouldn't dare contradict anything that Jamie says. I think that Jamie's explanation was fair enough, and I would like to quote John Trim, the person behind the development of the CFR 2001 here, when he talked about exams.
Neus, you seem to have frozen. I'm not sure if it's just for me.
No, I think frozen for me too. We may have lost
Right.
Neus.
Just lost her for a second. We'll see if she comes back. Might just be a temporary blip.
Okay, she might be logging back in, yeah.
No.
But I think, yeah, I mean, I think just to carry on that point until Neus can rejoin us, it really is about what you want to achieve. Oh, there's Neus. You back, Neus?
Yeah, no, I was just quoting John Trim's version of quality, which implied validity, reliability, accessibility, but also portability, which refers to what Jamie was talking about, being able to say, if you're a B2 and you want to study at a university somewhere in the world, this B2 needs to be comparable. Whereas if we're talking about a small context in a classroom, we may or we may not want to talk about a B2. We may want to talk about another label. We might want to use another label, and we may or may not want to refer to the CFR labels. But in any case, going back to the triangle, we always need to relate your curriculum, your program, your mission, your purpose, your assessment, and the way you negotiate your curriculum and your assessment to a reference point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Jamie, did you want to add what you started to say when we lost Neus?
No, I was just filling in while Neus, you were frozen for a bit there before we caught you back up, and then we got your final comment. So that's fine. Now we can move on to the questions in the chat if you like.
Okay, so the next question we've got, which is actually the first question, and this is aimed at Neus. It comes from Andrew, who says, the objective of high stakes tests is to assess whether students are sufficiently proficient to advance to a higher level of education. However, the CEFR is focused on the ability to use language communicatively in real world situations. As a result, school teachers tend to focus on the former rather than the latter. Is this a valid summary of the current situation? And if so, how can this conflict be resolved? In addition, assessment is dependent on assessors with sufficient language assessment skills, which is not always possible in some Asian countries. Is this a recognised issue?
Oh, yes. Yes, Andrew, it is a recognized issue. We've been working on this for quite a number of years now. And this is why we talk about quality in assessment. We talk about assessment and real life skills. We talk about language-oriented, learning-oriented assessment, as Nick pointed out in his presentation. So, and overall, we've been working for the past 10 years on language assessment literacy, how to publicize better what assessment means and what it could mean. If the high stakes test that you refer to is a good quality test, this test will refer to real life abilities and the abilities and the skills and the activities described in the CFR. So preparing for this test, which is normally considered by us assessors a danger, should not be a problem, because what you would be preparing the students for is using the language in real life. But yes, the profession has been worried for a number of years on the dangers of teaching to the test, which imply narrowing the curricula, and instead of working on the curriculum, which normally describes globally what the student should be able to do at the end of that course of study, instead of, having a wide focus, you narrow the focus to what you think the exam tests. And assessment literacy means that teachers understand better the tests, that testers make better tests, and the students understand tests as well. The best way to prepare for a test is by listening, reading, talking, and writing. In the same way that the best way to prepare for a marathon is not to run a marathon every Monday and Wednesday, but to have a special diet, to stretch, to run, of course, every day for a while, but to do a number of activities that will eventually help you run the marathon and have a good result. So yes, the profession is worried about this. Yes, there's a long way to go. And yes, the key issue is assessment literacy if we want to look at that triangle: assessment, curriculum, and delivery, with something at the center, be it the CFR, be it the Vietnamese curriculum, be it the Indonesian curriculum.
Yeah. Could I just add something here, Carol?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. That's an excellent analogy, though, the marathon analogy, Neus. Jamie, yeah.
So what Neus is talking about, teaching to the standards. So all good tests should be based on standards, and you teach to the standards. And another way Tony Green has framed that as teaching to the construct. What actually, kind of in terms of language proficiency, is the test targeted and based on? But I think that idea of, even if you've got a good test and it's targeting standards, there can be a narrowing of what's taught if people only teach even to the standards of the construct. And I think that's what Neus was talking about too, that issue of the narrowing to the construct. And I think this is a design problem, in that we go back to that triangle. This is something that systems have to think about at the school level, at the sort of the government level, in terms of setting, Ministry of Education level, in terms of setting curriculum goals and assessment goals. So assessment within a school context in particular has to be wider than just tests. If you're going to evaluate those parts of the construct, those standards that you can't put into the main testing situation, you have to have other ways of evaluating, of other kind of assignments and projects, and you have to expand. But if they're not worth something, I think what Andrew's pointing out, the teachers will just narrow in on whatever's going to get the marks. So at a design level, in the comprehensive learning system, evaluation has to be about more than just the tests, and it has to count. But at the same time, teaching to standards. When just a final comment about assessors not being qualified in Asia, I'll just say to Andrew that I think, I taught for 20 years in Japan. I've worked for 10 years now with the British Council, had an opportunity to work in a lot of countries. I've worked with a lot of European colleagues for a long time on the CFR. This is something we see people all over the world say. And it's a developmental thing, and people progress, and it's always a work in progress, to be honest. But it's certainly not something that's unique to Asia. I've seen similar sort of kind of questions raised in South America and across Europe. The issue of language assessment literacy since the CFR came out has been an issue across countries in Europe too. And it is a real issue. But what I'd also say is sometimes we need to be a little bit more confident about the progress that people are making, because quite often we think our situation's unique. And quite often people say their situation is uniquely bad, and actually it's not. When we talk about the shared issues and problems, and coming to events like this is a way of seeing that other people share the problems, and then we can share the solutions as well. There are issues, but I'd say sometimes we perhaps need to be a little bit more confident in the progress people are making, because people coming to this conference are really interested in making progress. So that's a demonstration that there are a lot of educators out there wanting to learn more, I think.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, the next question we had, this is an interesting one. I don't know to what extent you guys will be able to answer it, because it's about the Indonesian situation, but it comes from Fatul Muin, who says, in the transformation curriculum in Indonesia, it seems it ignores standardized tests. Am I true? We only focus on literacy and numeracy test. Does it flow until in university? How about PISA, which is always one consideration in our newest curriculum? So who would like to start on that? Any volunteers?
I'm not sure if I understand the question. I think it has to do with the presentation in Indonesia, where the new curriculum was presented and the new assessment system was presented, and how standardized tests were not present anymore, but the beginning was to have basically literacy and numeracy tests, because that was seen as a key learning issue in the Indonesian context. PISA has an impact, and PISA is a good example of how things can be misinterpreted. Going back to Andrew's question before, the idea behind PISA was to develop an assessment system that would foster comparability, but would also foster a competency-oriented learning, teaching, and assessment. And this is why PISA tests looked so different when they were first developed something like 20 years ago. The thing is that because of a lack of assessment literacy, many nations started considering PISA a standard, and they started teaching in classrooms and in extracurricular activities to pass the PISA test. So as Jamie said, I think that learning is getting better, and teaching is getting better, and assessment is getting better. In Europe, for example, 20 years ago, our tests were far, far less, I would say, good. And in 20 years, this has improved a lot. So I think that PISA as a reference is a good point, because they put into practice what tests have to be put into practice to be competency-based, construct-based, and not only focusing on discrete items. But I think standardized tests have their role, but they're not always crucial, because you need to think in the context of, primary, for example, that there's all sorts of types of assessment depending on the purpose behind that. So as long as, going back to the triangle again, as you know exactly where you're heading, and Nick Saville made a comment on that, as assessment helps you see where you are, where you're heading, and where you come from. The beginning is when you start teaching, you need to know where your students are and where you want to take them and what you're going to do to help them get from here to where you're going to take them. And this is the crucial thing. So there may be a role or not for a standardized assessment, depending on the context. Sorry,
Yeah.
Jamie, I jumped at the...
No, that's fine. And I absolutely agree. And I think in terms of PISA, I would agree with everything you've said, Neus. There may be a role for it, but you probably wouldn't want to make it your de facto curriculum, but there would be a role for it. I don't know the details of the Indonesian situation, so I wouldn't like to comment on the specifics of what's in the Indonesian standards and whatnot. But I think what's important is what Neus said about the 20 years of development in Europe, which I kind of witnessed firsthand as being quite phenomenal, really. And also, as I said, in the context of Japan, in terms of professional development. And a lot of what drove that was not a government-led thing or a top-down thing. It was really a community-based thing about teachers. For example, the European Association of Language Testing and Assessment, which both Neus and I are active members in, has played a large role in that professionalization by providing a forum to teachers to come together and discuss. And it gives them ammunition, if you like, to take back to their own context to discuss with ministries of education. And I'd suggest in Indonesia, this kind of professionalization and forum-based discussion, if you have issues or questions around what's in the Indonesian standards and curriculum, this kind of teacher collaboration to come together and say, we need more clarity, we need that ability to look forward, and it's not there. These kind of forums are a fantastic way to build that that discussion in a public way and help teachers professionalize and to get more information from the government if you feel that it's not there and from the ministry at the moment. And I think in Europe we can say that that kind of professional collaboration, you know, organizations like Teflon provide a huge opportunity to continue these discussions, I think. And I'd say from our experience with EALTA in Europe, teacher collaboration in those professional forums can play a huge role in improving the situation.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so those were all the questions that we had in the chat. One other question that we've got is perhaps an interesting one to maybe sort of bring the conversation to a close. So something for people to be aware of going forward. What are the disadvantages or the dangers of not being able to reflect diversity in your context? So we've talked about sort of local standards and global standards, but having to still adhere to standards. So what are the dangers or the disadvantages of not being able to reflect diversity in your individual context? Neus, would you like to start with that?
Yeah, I was responding to a question in the chat. So if you could please repeat it.
Yeah, certainly will. Yeah. So what are the disadvantages or dangers of not being able to reflect diversity in your context?
I think that diversity, that in my context, diversity has always been
Have we lost Neus again? I think Neus is having issues with her internet. Jamie, did you want to make a start on that one? In the meantime?
Yeah, and just if Neus can sing out when she's back in. Are you back there, Neus? I can see you're on mute now. Are you had frozen for a bit? Yeah.
Oh, are you back?
Now, the idea is that during the process of teaching and learning, during your assessment, you have to check that your students get an idea of the progress they are making. You need to observe what progress they're making, and they need to be aware of the progress they're making. At the end of the process, this progress may or may not have been enough. And that's when the student may or may not fail, or may not be allowed to go to the following course. But that doesn't mean that although many teachers learn about this early on, they should not encourage their students so that they can continue making progress. Did I answer your question?
Think so. Jamie, anything to add?
I think it depends what you mean by diversity too. I mean, diversity, you know, what are we trying to, it's obviously a hugely topical, important discussion now. And it's similar to the discussion around standards, around how global or general a set of standards can be and how localized or contextualized. And when we get to diversity, we get down to how individualized education can be. And very often this is about awareness, isn't it? It's about awareness. Sometimes we're not even aware of what kind of diversity is there or we need to be taking account of. And similarly with language assessment literacy, this is really a process of education, teacher training, but also resourcing. The more individualized and diverse we want to, diversity we'll want to accommodate, the more resources we need at an individual level for a teacher to be able to do that as well. So I by no means think it's easy. It's obviously very, very important, and it's another one of those areas of works in progress. Is diversity reflected sufficiently in our standards? I would say probably not. I think that's probably a fair comment, that the standards are by their nature generalized, and then that next level is how do you adapt them to reflect the contextual diversity that you need to in your situation. Do we need more guidelines around how to do that? Probably I'd say yes, and that may be an issue that organizations like IELTA going forward can take up more when we discuss how to apply things like the CFR and looking at, well, what is the implication for reflecting diversity in those? Like most of these things, I think it's definitely a work in progress.
Mm-hmm. Neus, you got your hand up.
Yeah. Yeah, and what I wanted to say is that this is in fact a missing thing in the companion volume. In the CFR, those of you who used it, at the end of each chapter, and even sometimes at the end of some sections, you had a question for the readers and the users. In your context, you need to decide how far you can go in using this. You need to find out what is best for you. You need to blah, blah, blah. And there were reflection questions that helped readers and users consider their context, their needs, and how to approach this. And this is something that the idea was that it should be included in the companion volume, but which in the end it was not included. And I'm sorry that it wasn't, because people now are using more and more the companion volume and not the companion volume and the CFR. So this is why in the handbook that we've published to align language education to the CFR with the British Council, IELTA, UCALTA, and ALTE, what we've done is that at the end of each chapter, we say, look, advice. If you're working on your own, you may want to consider this. If you're working as a group, or if you are responsible for if you're a leader in a group, you may want to do this. Consider the resources you have, consider the time you have, consider your needs. And this is a way of facilitating adaptation to each context within a frame, within a set of standards that are explicitly described.
Okay, thanks. We've actually had one last question, so we'll finish up with this because I think this is a good question. It possibly brings us back to where we started. So this is from Akihiro, and Akihiro says, thank you for the interesting topic. Since last year, Japan has set new targets for English proficiency for high school students in B1 and B2 of the CEFR. However, the current situation in the educational field is very divergent, and even if they are targets, their feasibility is quite difficult to achieve. This is partly because the EFL environment is particularly difficult for output skills, speaking and writing. This is a difficult problem for evaluators, instructors with language assessment skills. Therefore, they tend to be biased towards evaluation of word difficulty and reading content. Given this current situation, it seems that B1 and B2 as targets are specialised in reading and listening for university entrance examinations. However, there's also a gap between the demands of the business community and those of university entrance examinations. To what extent should this be flexible and adapted to the actual situation in the field as standardisation and localisation? So I think that's a question that will bring us full circle, I think. So Jamie, do you want to start as it's about Japan?
Yeah. And once again, I think the issues that you're raising here, Akihiro, are certainly not specific to Japan. The similar issues, I think, raised everywhere. But a lot of the questions you're asking are about policy level questions. So things that we find individual to influence ourselves, but as a community, we can come together to have that influence. One thing I will say about Japan and the fact that the Ministry of Education has given the targets for high school graduates as B1 or B2, and it used to be A2 or B1. One positive thing I'd like to say about that is that it does give a choice. And that's more than I've seen in a lot of education systems where ministries tend to go for a blanket, everyone needs to be B2 or everyone needs to be B1. So even giving some flexibility there to say to some high schools, look, B1 may be enough for you. And for others, B2 may be enough for you. Even that is a positive step forward, I think. But I think, you know, what we've always said is don't set blanket goals. And one of the roles of the CFR, and this is something at a policy level needs to be reflected more, is that ability to set profiles. So if in a context where speaking is going to be very difficult and it's an unrealistic target, maybe, and actually in a workplace environment, what is needed most? Is it speaking and writing? Is it reading and listening? You know, being able to make more use of the CFR profiles. What is your CFR level in different skills, and what is the level that is required in those skills? Probably it's going to be very different in different employment contexts. There may be some employment contexts where people are never going to speak to anyone, but probably need to read a lot of documents, and where reading is actually a really important skill. There may be others where actually they need to interact in an international business environment and they need to have English to speak and collaborate with international teams where English is a lingua franca and speaking is the skill. These are kind of, it's about language assessment literacy and policy literacy at a wider level, I think, because the CFR was always about being able to set profiles. And unfortunately, I think when you have blanket, you have to be B2 at everything.
Yeah.
Why is the question we should ask, and what for? And then when you try to set a blanket target for an entire education system, you're almost guaranteeing failure. So I think building in flexibility and individualized goal setting was always one of the goals of the CFR, but you know, it hasn't been achieved, I think, because at a policy level, it's still much easier to set blanket targets. But ministries inevitably fail because not everyone gets to B2, and they don't need to. But I think one positive thing about the Japanese context is at least the ministry has allowed some variation in there, and sort of building on that a little bit more would be a positive thing, I think. But it's more variation that's allowed by a lot of ministries, I can say.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. And Neus, any comments?
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more with Jamie. I think that the needs of the business world are different from the needs of the academic world. If you are nearing the end of your university studies, you may have to learn how to speak or how to present. But if you are at the beginning of your course of study, basically what you have to do is read articles and listen to presentations, etc. Also, another issue is that in many business situations, it would not be fair to ask for a B2 in writing, for example, because technology comes to your help. And these days, nobody starts writing a report without looking at the previous report, at other reports in the web, in the web, and see how help can be got there. So maybe if you ask somebody to write a report sort of, you know, solo with no help, will not do it as well as that person would do it if that person had access to his computer.
Yeah.
So I think that needs and purposes vary, and this needs to inform the requests for certificates.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, both of you, for your comments. That was really insightful. Thank you for the questions from the chat as well and from the audience. We're going to move into the second part of the webinar now, which is where I hand over to my colleague Jan, and he will be leading the Q&A on the breakout presentations. So I'll hand over to Jan and I will say thank you very much, Jamie and Neus.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So hi everyone, it's about time we head over to the breakout presentations for today's webinar. We have accepted no fewer, I should say, than 10 presentations, the recordings of which you will have had a chance to watch prior to this webinar. We will not be showing the recordings here due to obvious time constraints. Now, in order to, refresh people's memories a little bit, or, maybe in case some people haven't watched the videos, I will give each presenter up to 2 minutes to very briefly introduce their study. And in order to make it, a little bit more manageable, I've divided the presentations into groups of 3 that are somewhat thematically linked. So I'll have people introduce themselves, accept a number of questions before we move on to the next group of 3. Make sure that if you have any questions, you put them in the chat as quickly as possible, because we won't have time to go over a great amount of questions. Again, due to time constraints today. Now, the first 3 presentations that I wanted to draw attention to are linked to the CSE, China Standards of English. First, I'd like to welcome Professor Li Jiuliang from the Beijing Institute of Fashion Design. Professor Li, could you briefly introduce your study?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Jan. I'm very happy to see you in person. I'm Li Jiuliang. I'm from Beijing Institute of Fashion Technology, and I'm very happy to present my study in this conference. Our research is informed by the understanding and knowledge that self-efficacy belief significantly predicts learning outcomes. And formative assessment, or assessment for learning, is said to be able to promote self-efficacy. Our study investigated how L2 writers' self-efficacy is influenced by assessment for learning, or AFL for short, and how it's influenced by perception of peer assessment, and how it influenced by perception of teacher help. Our study is conducted in an English class, English course that promotes assessment for learning at a Chinese university. 44 students wrote 5 essays of different genres, followed by peer assessment sessions for a semester. The L2 writer self-efficacy questionnaire was administered in week 1, week 10, and week 17 over the semester, treated as a pre, post, and delayed post intermission survey. Data also includes reflective notes written after the peer assessment session and a survey of perception of peer assessment administered at the course end. The results of repeated measure and mixed ANOVA and qualitative analysis of students' reflections show that assessment for learning exerts significant effects on the development of self-efficacy beliefs of the participants. And perception of peer assessment teacher help also effectively cause and moderate and explain the effects of assessment for learning on L2 writer self-efficacy. Our implications are discussed with reference to promoting assessment for learning and peer assessment in the classroom, where teachers play an important role in nurturing students' self-efficacy belief. That's my brief introduction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Li. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Huan Mei from the Shanghai International Studies University.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So, good afternoon. Hello, everyone. I'm Huan Mei from Shanghai International Studies University. So actually, my research is about the cognitive diagnostic assessment of translation competence. While translation competence assessment has been playing an increasing role in translation teaching, learning, and assessment, it still fails to offer fine-grained information about students' certain translation competence in a detailed way. So this study is aimed to investigate the feasibility of providing diagnostic information about students' translation competence by integrating China's standards of English, the counterpart to the Chinese counterpart to CFR, with cognitive diagnostic assessment approaches, CDA. Under the descriptive parameter framework of CSE translation skills, an attribute pool was established from which 7 attributes were identified based on students and experts think aloud protocols. A checklist comprising 20 descriptors was developed from CSE translation skills, with which students' translation responses were reached by 5 experts. In addition, a Q matrix was established by 7 experts by comparing the diagnostic performance of 4 widely used cognitive diagnostic models, that is CDMs. LLM model was selected as the optimal model to generate fine-grained information about students' translation strengths and weaknesses. The findings can provide insights for translation, teaching, learning, and assessment. That is the brief introduction about my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Liu Qianwen from Xi'an Jiaotong University.
Could you hear my voice?
Yes, just fine.
Okay. Am I able to share the screen? Just one slide for a brief introduction.
Sure.
Okay. Yes. Hello, everyone, and thank you for the speak by the previous professors and doctors. And my study in the video presentation is a preliminary step of alignment research. And basically, there are 2 questions were raised in this study. First is, what constructs can be extracted from the reading skills of CSE 3? And the second is, to what extent the reading constructs in high school entrance exam are aligned with CSE? And we know that the CSE was just implemented in 2018, and since its implementation, there are a bunch of related studies, such as CSE-based test analysis or alignment studies, etc. So the study aims to address the content validation of the language tests based on the language standards. And we had in total 23 reading items from the high school entrance exam. The exam is high stakes in China because it decides students' admission to high school. And in terms of the research methods, for question 1, we decide 6 reading constructs through expert judgment and document analysis in order to build the coding framework. And 5 experts participated in this process. And then we held a training session for experts to familiarize them with the standards. And then we conduct 2 rounds coding, which is achieved through the Delphi technique. It is a decision-making method usually used in weather forecasting or politics-related studies, but it is the first time we used in the language testing field. And then we have undergone some statistical procedures to confirm the reading constructs. So overall, the study have 3 implications. The first is it gives advices to the adjustment of future test development. And also, since the study is starting from the original differences, so we also reviewed some differences among the different regions of different developmental regions. And in terms of the research methodology, since we applied the Delphi technique, it is a relatively innovative method, which is not being applied in language testing field. And so that's about my presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Qianwen. So I would like to open the floor for any questions from the audience or from the other speakers as well. In the meantime, I have a question for Professor Lee. Your study, the results show that peer feedback has a positive impact on students' self-efficacy. What was the role of the CSE in this?
Thank you for your question. I have talked about the relation of CSE and of my study, but I didn't mention it in the brief introduction just now because I assume that the audience had watched my video. The relation between CSE and my study is that during the process of students doing peer assessment, they are trained to use peer assessment report form, and the peer assessment report form is part of the peer assessment process. And while they're doing the peer assessment, they also use a rubric. So just now, some speakers have mentioned using rubric in writing assessment. And the rubric is developed based on CSE. Our team developed, I think the first part of our project is to develop the CSE rubric. So this is the relation between CSE and our study. So most importantly, the students use a rubric which is developed based on CSE. And I'd like to give a brief introduction of our rubric. The rubric contains four subscales or 4 components, including coherence, cohesion, grammar.
It seems you've frozen up. Can anyone else hear Professor Lee? Okay, he seems to have dropped out here. I see you,
Okay,
Professor Lee. I can see you again in the guest list. Would you like to finish your response?
Okay. My response, the important part is about the relation between CSE and our research. We use a CSE-based rubric for students used in the peer assessment process. Okay, that's the relation.
Okay. I also have a question for Dr. Liu. You mentioned in your recording that in big Chinese tests such as CET4 and CET6 have been linked to the CSE. Now, your study concerned the Zhongkao, right? The high school entrance test. What are some challenges in using the CSE and applying it to this particular test?
Yes, thank you for your question. I think the first challenge is because the test is not has not been linked to the standards before. So it is it is designed according to the national curriculums, which are different like standards compared with the Chinese standards of English. So it is a first challenge because we have to address the imbalance, the difference between the new standards and an already existing tests. it is the first challenge. And the second is when we are using the standards, we found that some of the contents do not fit the actual tests. I think it is the same cause with the first challenge, because and also it is a possible disadvantage of the standards because it is stipulated to accommodate the teaching and assessment within the Chinese context, and also it is the main purpose of the usage. The main purpose of using CSE is focused primarily on research purposes and not teaching and learning purposes. I think it is one of the disadvantage of the like unified standards, and it is also the common problem of the standards used in Chinese context.
Thank you very much. The next question here is for Dr. Huan Mei. For your study, you combined, two sets of standards actually, the CSE as well as CDA, right? Cognitive Diagnostic Assessment to measure translation competence. Do you think that this approach has, any use beyond translation or measuring translation competence? For example, more general English as well.
Yes, thank you very much. As for the cognitive diagnostic research, actually it has been used in many other fields like listening, writing, and reading. Yeah, you can find a lot of research, CD research. So actually, my research on the translation competence is actually based on the previous experience on listening, reading, and writing. So I think there are still a lot of room for the application of CDA combined with CSE.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions for these three presenters?
Can I ask?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
I'd like to ask the first speaker, Lee. You missed you wanted to explain the CSE rubrics, and then you mentioned it grammar. One is grammar, and the other one is coherence, cohesion. And what the other two? Could you elaborate a bit more about your about the rubrics?
Okay, thank you very much for your question. Our CSE-based rubric contains 4 components or 4 subscales, as I've just mentioned, and including grammar, vocabulary, and coherence, cohesion, and task fulfillment. These are the 4 subscales of our rubric, and I'd like to elaborate on the last subscale, which is task fulfillment. As CSE is a large, has a very big, large, and comprehensive descriptors of Chinese learners' English proficiency, and it contains many descriptors and is focused on, I think, 3 to 4 writing genres, including narrative, argumentative, and expositive, and descriptive. So I try to put all the 4 types of tasks into my rubric to assess how students accomplish their task, to see how they perform, how they fulfill their task goals. But actually, I think in most books or articles, people or researchers generally put writing into 3 general categories. They combine narrative and descriptive. So I just drop descriptive. So our final rubric contains three genres, that is narrative, expositive, and argumentative. So I think this is one of the feature of our rubric. That's about our rubric.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for your question as well, Professor Hirai. I'd like to move on now then to our next group of presenters. All of their studies, focused on the Japanese contexts. So first of all, we have a study that was authored by 5 presenters, 3 of whom are here today, Professor Akio Hirai and Mr. Yusuke Kubo from the University of Tsukuba, Professor Hiroki Maeda from Matsuyama University, Professor Hideaki Oka from the University of Nagano, and Ms. Shiharu Yamada from the University of Tsukuba again. Go ahead, please introduce your study.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Our study is about developing and validating a framework for critical thinking and creativity skills, abbreviated as CD and C skills, which are increasingly important for us in today's information society. Our research is comprised of 2 studies. In study 1, to develop tasks that nurture and assess students' CD skills, we investigated existing CD models such as Neus studies and found that CD skills are closely related to summary writing skills. Therefore, we chose a summary writing task and defined its construct as clarification, consistency, and generalization. As for creativity, we chose an essay writing task because the process of essay writing seems to require divergent thinking skills, which are really essential for creativity, and defined 5 constructs of essay task as comprehensibility, organization consistency, ideas, explanations, and creativity, based on the revised Bloom's taxonomy and ICE model. In study 2, we investigated whether the summary and the essay task reflect construct we assume to be measured. 52 Japanese university EFL students took essay and summary and essay writing tasks and then answered the questionnaire asking what skills they needed to complete the tasks. The result of the summary task, more than 80% of the students used CD skills relevant to clarification and consistency, while about 70% used generalization skills. Regarding the essay writing task, students used both CD and C skills. In particular, many students raised creativity is one of the important and necessary skills, besides vocabulary and grammar. In conclusion, most students used intended CD and C skills when they wrote a summary and essay, and we therefore confirmed the face validity of these tasks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up is Mr. Akihiro Matsura from the University of Reading. Please go ahead.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you fine.
Okay. Yeah. Let me share my screen. Yes, thank you. Okay. The quick presentation today. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Akihiro Matsura. Last year, I just graduated from MA in TESOL at the University of Reading. So I had a great opportunity to collaborate with the British Council's Assessment Research Group, which led my research topic fluency in the speaking test. Okay. This is my background. Last year, the Japanese marked a watershed in English education in Japan. So the Japanese government became concerned about the low performance of Japanese English learners. Therefore, brand new goals for high school students is set at B1, B2 so far. So I made an attempt to find characteristics of fluency. So what is fluency? Utterance fluency is divided into three aspects, as you see. Repair is a measurement which monitors repair strategies. Tabacori and Hunter are divided into 4 different levels, and the utterance fluency is categorized a very narrow perspective. Then Tabacori et al. Argue that repair fluency has complicated features because they did not show any differences. So they argue that repair fluency has shown no linear progression, no systematical distinction. So that many studies looked into the total number of repairs, but they don't show anything. So I looked into repair measures individually. So these are the 5 repair measures I set: false starts, reformulations, hesitations, repetitions, and replacements, based on the Forster scan. Then the fluency rate descriptors repair fluency as an important construct in testing. So such as IELTS or aptitude routines. So aptitude test. So there are lots of repair fluency in descriptors. So they're heavily relying on repair fluency. So these are my research questions. We got one is about the distinction in the use of repair measures. The other is about whether the task design affects or not. Then this is regarding the methodology. I pick up the study, utilize the 12 Japanese students recording data. Then phase 1, I counted the fluency, their fluency frequently with AS unit code data. Then phase 2, I use conversation analysis to investigate how repair measures were used. So let's check the results. To begin with, these are the total number of repair measures. B1 group is in blue, whereas B2 group is in orange. The left shows the number of repairs per 60 seconds, whereas the right displays the usage rate repairs per word per minute. So the B2 group scored lower than the B1 group for all tasks for both numbers and rates. So this suggests that B2 group used fewer repair measures than B1 group. But interestingly, when false start and reformulations were calculated separately, false start resulted in not much difference. However, the tasks were affected. In contrast, reformulations clearly showed both differences across levels and tasks. So this suggests that false starts alone make no real difference, whereas reformulations show a real difference across levels. Then curiously, hesitations did not show any level differences. Meanwhile, like reformulations, repetitions clearly illustrated distinctions across levels and tasks. Then finally, replacements showed no noticeable differences across levels, whereas the clear differences were observed between tasks. So these figures provide a summary of the mean number and usage rate. So as you see, the repetitions and reformulations, the B1 is more than twice as high as P2 in both numbers of rate of use. And this is a conversation analysis. I found
Akihiro, can I please urge you to move to the implications of the study, please, because presenters lined up and we don't have that much time, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Right. Then, based on my findings, I put in the 3 discussion parts. Then, recommendations and implications that for amending the rating descriptors. The current one, the different and modified ones. Also, for students and runners, I suppose that they should need more same value of the common ground between the teachers and learners about the fluency. Then the another one is effective educational activities. So so they should have a more pre-task planning time for their classroom activities for speaking. Yeah, thank you for my listening. Thank you.
Thank you. And our last Japan-focused presentation is by Mr. Andrew Drought from British Council, Japan. Please go ahead, Andrew.
Okay, hi there. So I'm Andrew Drought. I work at the British Council in Japan as senior teacher for corporate and university contracts. And my presentation was the rather lengthy one on some classroom research to see how we can use the learning from the online experience during COVID, and also the experience learning from the comprehensive learning system that Professor O'Sullivan wrote about, to take more of a comprehensive learning system approach in the classroom. So what that meant, learning from the online experience, what that meant basically was cutting down the amount that we tried to cover during a class. As during the online experience, we couldn't do a great deal, or not as much as face-to-face. So the idea was continuing after the online experience had finished to try and do less in the class. And that meant moving exercises to homework that we couldn't do in class, and reducing the amount we covered in class allowed the original intention of the course, the task-based learning approach, to come out more, and more time for people to take on the challenge of actually using English in the class. And it also created more space in the class for assessment, various assessments, which we tried to align with the outcomes from the syllabus and take a comprehensive learning system approach. So yeah, simpler lessons with more assessment basically, and the results we found was that the teachers were happy because it was simpler to teach the lessons, more enjoyable for the students, more chance to communicate, more task repetition. Students had to dig deeper to find the language they wanted to use in the lesson, push their English on. Students thought the homework was useful, even though there was a lot more of it, and they really engaged with the assessments that we did with the class. The students actually really enjoyed that part of the lesson, and found engaging with their own learning to be an enjoyable thing to do. And finally, most importantly, the stakeholder feedback stayed really high. The feedback from the university had been the highest we'd ever had while we were teaching online, possibly because it suited the students very well. No time to talk about that. But after COVID finished and we went back to the face-to-face classroom, I think through using the ideas that I talk about in the lecture, it actually helped maintain that higher feedback that we were getting, because it remained the same even when we went back to the face-to-face class. And I think it was taking a simpler approach in the classroom and taking a comprehensive learning system approach that really helped with that.
Okay, thank you very much.
That's my very unacademic presentation. Thank you for
that was great.
You for
thank
having
you very
me.
much. It's really enlightening, and see what's happening. Are there any questions from anyone about these three presentations?
I have a question for the first presenter. I think the first presenter is talking about writing skills, and I'm very much interested in F4 writing. And I noticed that they try to validate a framework for critical thinking and creative skills for writing tasks, and specifically they focus on summary writing. But I think summary writing involves a writer to condense the text already written by a writer. So I don't think I don't think there are much critical thinking or creativity skills involved in summary writing. So I would like to ask the presenter, please explain the type of creativity or critical thinking skill they have observed in the process. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Maybe should I answer the question or some other? Okay, I will answer the question. Actually, we provided a text for summary, and then the bottom of the text there is a question about for the essay task, and the question is really requires the kind of creativity. Students really have to think about the problem, how to solve the problem about the text mentioned about the kind of problem, and the student really have to think about the how to solve the problem. So really, they have to need some kind of creative creativity skills, and based on their results, we realize that the student really think that the creativity and imagination are really required. So I think depend upon the question, how you ask the student the question, I think.
Okay, I agree. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have a question to I forgot about the false starts and reformulations. Mr. Matsura? Yeah. Okay, I have a question. I think your research is really interesting because you analyze the 5 categories, and you find some differences, and reformulations and repetitions are really influenced by proficiency, while the other 3 are not. So why do you think there are some kind of distinct differences?
Yes, thank you for the good question. Yes, I'm really interested in these findings. The number of repetitions and reformulations are quite different between the levels. About the reformulations, I think there is a kind of based on the grammatical skill. So reformulations tends to be should use the modify the tenses or the singular or plural or some much more many grammatical skills. So that is one of the cause. Then repetition is very easy to understand how we speak about especially for the Elch language. So repetitions has storing time, storing behaviors to conduct the next content or what we say about supporting the ideas. So these reformulation repetitions are quite significant distinction with these repair measures, I guess.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, so in the interest of timing, I mean, we will not be able to wrap it up before 11:30, obviously. We still have 4 presentations to go. So let's move on to our remaining 4 presentations, the first of which is from Dr. Susan Sheehan and Dr. Tai Chui from the University of Huddersfield and Dr. Trinh Nguyen, if I pronounce this correctly, from the University of Language and International Studies. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So our project explored the provision of English language assessment and testing, including online assessment of English in Vietnam. And we were looking at how we could use assessment to promote fairness and inclusivity in Vietnam. And it was a joint project between the University of Huddersfield and the University of Languages and International Studies, VNU, in Vietnam. We were looking at assessment practices, we were looking at what the teachers were doing in the classroom, but also we were looking at why they were doing it. So we were looking at it from a framework of language assessment literacy, which was spoken about in the earlier discussion today. Our data collection instruments were questionnaire, observation with follow-up interviews, focus group discussions, and interviews with key stakeholders in English language education in Vietnam. And the results of the project have fed into the development of a toolkit, and this covers 6 areas which the teachers identified as wanting more information, more opportunity to discuss and practice, and the toolkit is available in both English and Vietnamese, and also the development of an online community of practice for teachers in Vietnam to share their ideas and also to bring in speakers such as myself or outside academics to also input into the field of language assessment in Vietnam. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Sun Qiyu from Shanghai Jiao Tong University.
Okay, thank you very much, Jan, for chairing this session, for giving me the chance to introduce my research again. Okay, now I'll just get started. As we know, peer assessment is a common pedagogical practice for evaluating students' writings in college English classrooms. So our study compared peer feedback to teacher feedback and explored the different strategies by peer readers as well as their impacts on draft revision. And 2 research questions were answered in this study. And the first one is, to what extent can peer feedback supplement teacher feedback in improving essay writing? And the second one is, what are the features of peer feedback compared to teacher feedback, and how do they affect feedback taking? And drawing on 3 natural language processing tools, this study assessed changes in writing performance by comparing 22 selected indices in 3 linguistic dimensions. And peer and teacher feedback was then coded and analyzed qualitatively to explore how features of feedback influence draft revision. And we confirmed peer feedback as an effective classroom assessment method to improve students' writing, though limited compared to teacher feedback as reflected in the indices. And also, we believe that writing assessment in classrooms should be more diversified, since multiple perspectives of evidence instead of scores only can help to assess the process and a change of students' writing ability more accurately. And thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Qiyu. Our next speaker is Mr. Andrew Rochford from British Council in Bangladesh.
Good afternoon or good morning to everyone from Bangladesh. You can hear me okay?
Yeah, just fine.
Good. I'll very quickly go through my study, which was entitled Introducing Continuous Assessment of Spoken English into Bangladeshi Primary School Classrooms, a study of. And the driver for this was the Bangladeshi government introducing competency-based curriculum into their primary school system, which entails continuous assessment. So I did a survey. My tools were an online survey and a focus group, a small focus group meeting. I had a total of 117 primary school teachers responding. But from the authority level, there's a recognition by the government that changes need to occur, but there was no expertise to help with what and how. So it was a big problem for them, and I envisage many problems implementing continuous assessment in the classroom. For my study, looking at the research, first of all, I had to look at the formative assessment cycle, and I felt that it didn't quite highlight many of the issues, or some of the issues that we find here in Bangladesh. First of all, getting sufficient accessible output produced in a lesson. So it's always an assumption in the formative cycle that teachers are going to be able to get their students to produce English that can be assessed, but that doesn't always happen, either mainly due to the teachers not having sufficient pedagogic skills, or they're still working on a lecture-based system. Also, the teachers lack knowledge and the experience of evaluating and making decisions about output. And thirdly, in order to do an assessment, you need a wide range of knowledge in order to assess, both about English language, also about how young learners work, how they think, what type of tests are suitable for them. So I wanted to put that, I created a formative assessment model, which acted as a reference point for the rest of my study. And it's a big detailed diagram, which I'm not going to display here, obviously, because of time. My findings, the basic findings really corroborated my previous experience and also from previous research, but definitely not enough language is being produced in the classroom. Another aspect, I don't know how it is in other countries, is that teachers are not taught to reflect. So you can't do continuous assessment or a formative assessment cycle unless the teachers can reflect on what's occurred in the classroom. So they need to be educated and trained in how to reflect and how to make decisions. A third issue.
Let me stop you there real quick.
Yeah.
We have to move on to our last presenter for today, but certainly not least. Dr. Kim Jiun from the University of Hawaii at Manoa.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear just fine.
I'm a PhD student at University of Hawaii at Manoa. Yeah, today I'll be talking about my study. So since many American universities require some evidence of English proficiency to study abroad, many students are taking English proficiency tests, for example, TOEFL. And that has also made a lot of English test preparation became a really massive enterprise. And many Asian test takers, including Korean test takers, they rely on cram schools, which also offer both online and offline test preparation services. So I wanted to systematically analyze and observe what is happening there. And I used draw on the MASIC's type 1 to 3 test preparation practices and analysis. So the type 1 was actually about improving the construct relevant factors, which is really good, like actually teaching learning and learning English. But type 2 is still okay, just reducing construct irrelevant factor, which is like lowering the anxiety or helping students to get familiar with the test. And I found type 3 could be a little bit more problematic because type 3 is a improving construct irrelevant factor, which is like memorizing the template, the set phrases, formulaic chunks, or they also made students to fabricate examples to support for the supporting evidences. So later on in the discussion, I draw on some validity arguments that if the students are actually using the templates or fabricating the examples, the test result might not reflect the academic writing ability. Or is this really promotes communicative activities, or is it a really educational practices? So it might also violate the inferences of utilization consequences. So it might not bring the educationally good consequences. So I don't think it's the only matter of Korea, or it's not the only matter of TOEFL. So we can, I urge test takers or high stakeholders to pay attention to these inferences again. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'd like to open the floor for any questions about these 4 presentations. I actually have a question for Dr. Sun Qiyu. Watching your video, you mentioned that students and teachers, that they provide different types of feedback, and that this feedback actually complements each other in many ways. One of your recommendations later on was that there should be more training in providing feedback. how much do you think that the differences in feedback are the result of a lack of training provided to the students? And that if they are provided more training in giving feedback, that in fact, maybe their feedback will become very similar to that of the teachers?
Okay, thank you for your question. Actually, we don't know how much difference can be explained by lack of training, but we think training at least can improve students' feedback from two aspects. The first one is we observed that most students are not inclined to provide feedback from the perspective like sentence level grammars, like how complex the sentence is, and they are more inclined to provide suggestions from paragraph level, like structure. So if enough training is provided, students may be guided to provide more suggestions, pay more attention to sentence level errors or grammaticality. And the second perspective is because many students don't know how to use words properly, or they lack such knowledge like pragmatics, like to put words in the right context. So teachers may provide more guidance on how to look up the correct use of words, like guide students to use electronic dictionary or something else, to guide students to provide more feedback on lexical accuracy. So in this way, students may provide more feedback regarding vocabulary. Yes, that's my thought. Okay. Thank you for your question.
Thank you for your answer. I also have a question for Andrew Rochford. In your video, you bring forward the suggestion that missing language assessment literacy should be addressed in teachers, for example, knowledge of validity, task types, rating scales, and so on. Do you think that even if teachers' assessment literacy is improved, that there are still some difficulties in actually improving improving the situation and the assessment and feedback that students receive?
Yes, thank you. In terms of the knowledge that teachers require in order to do assessment, yeah, it's quite wide-ranging, but I don't think they necessarily need to have depth. They just need to have a very general overall understanding of what validity is and what context is, and those sorts of things. Yeah, I think that with the language assessment literacy, it covers the whole area, not just what's happening in the classroom, but also what the parents and guardians of the students are doing. They need to understand the types of tests and why that are occurring. And also the education authorities need to have some idea of national standards. So it's not just in the classroom, but it covers the authorities, the parents, the whole school context, the community as well. So that's where education needs to occur and be focused. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Then to Susan Sheehan, you mentioned that your study included both private and public institutions, and that even within these groupings, that sometimes teachers had much more influence, much more say in the creation of assessments. Did you find any differences that were interesting between assessments used in public schools compared to private language schools?
I think one of the biggest differences was the resourcing. that the teachers in the private schools had access to a wide range of platforms. For example, all the children in the class would have a laptop, so they were able to conduct assessments through using these laptops and using the resources available, whereas in the state schools, perhaps the resources were more limited and there was the narrower range of assessment activities was available to the teachers. So I think it was at the level of resourcing is where we saw the biggest difference rather than practice or understanding of assessment.
Okay, thank you. Then my last question actually was to Kim Jun. You list a number of practices that Hagwons use to test prep students, and you also mentioned that these are not always very relevant to the construct. But do you see this situation improve? Because it seems like they are very rooted in their ways, and that did you find some resistance to change perhaps, and is there a way forward?
Thank you for the question. I think that will be a follow-up study, actually. In my study, I only observed those lectures, but maybe in the follow-up study, I would like to see what is happening there. In the follow-up study, I plan to analyze the forum that students exchange their information about the TOEFL, and that way maybe I can have a better understanding of it. I can see some resistance, but I don't know to what extent the strong resistance is. Yeah, sorry, I don't have a good answer.
That's fine. Thank you very much. I think we have come to the end of our session. Sorry if this was all a bit of a rushed affair, and especially sorry if I have rudely interrupted you. If anyone's interested in the recordings of the videos after seeing today's presentations, then you are still free to access them. I'm going to hand over back to Carolyn to wrap up.
Okay, thanks, Jan. Thanks to all the presenters in the breakout session. There were some really interesting presentations and some very interesting questions there as well. So I'd like to say thank you very much to the audience for taking the time to attend today. As Jan mentioned, the recording will be available, and as I mentioned at the beginning, it will be available on YouTube. So we'll send out an email to let people know when that's uploaded, and obviously then you can rewatch it and pass it on to your colleagues. I'd also like to thank our speakers today, Dr. Jamie Dunlea and Dr. Neus Figueras, for their interesting discussion. And thank you also again to the audience that posted questions. I'd also like to say a quick thank you to our colleague Neil Stead, who's in the background doing all the technical support. So thank you very much to Neil. I know often the back office staff or the back end staff sort of get missed out. So thank you to Neil, because without him, none of this would have happened, I would think. I'd also like to just say that Neil's going to post a link to a survey into the chat, and if we could ask you to complete that survey, that would be really helpful. And just to give you forewarning of our upcoming New Directions conferences. So we have 2 New Directions conferences coming up this year. One is in May in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And the other one is the New Directions East Asia Conference in Vietnam in October. So that's all that remains for me. Again, the links to those 2 conferences are being put in the chat. But thank you so much again to everybody, to all our presenters, to all our speakers, and again to you, the audience, for taking the time out of your busy days to come and listen to us. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a lovely day, evening, afternoon, night, whatever. Sleep well for those of you on the other side of the world. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.